Welcome to the Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel.
If you're looking for those shortcuts to critical knowledge and, those big intellectual breakthroughs, please subscribe and like so you can hear all our new book summaries.
We have a truly profound book on the table today. It's one that has, I think, fundamentally changed the entire conversation around mental health.
It really has. We are doing a deep dive into Bessel van der Kolk's monumental work, The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma.
Okay, so let's unpack this right away. This is so much more than just a typical psychology text.
Oh, absolutely.
It's more like a revolutionary call to recognize how our physical being, our organs, our nervous system, our immune response is just so deeply implicated in our emotional and mental health.
Right. The title itself, The Body Keeps the Score, that's basically the whole mission statement right there.
So what's our mission for this deep dive?
Well, our mission today is to really explore the scientific evidence that confirms that trauma leaves these indelible traces.
And not just on the mind, right? Not just the stories we tell ourselves.
Exactly. It's not just in the conscious mind. It's in our entire biology. It affects our stress hormone systems, our immune response, even our capacity for connection and, simple joy.
And van der Kolk's career, it started with a really startling discovery.
It did. He found that trauma is, first, pervasive. It affects generations, families, the whole of society. And second, it's fundamentally physiological.
So it's rooted in the entire organism's response.
It moves so far beyond that old idea that it was simply a matter of, mental weakness or just some repressed memories you had to dig up.
That initial hook is what makes this book so compelling, I think. The idea that the physical structure of our body, right down to the cellular level, is holding the story of past terror.
Yeah, that's it.
We spent decades kind of compartmentalizing trauma as something that happens to the mind.
Assuming that if you just talk about it enough, the mind will process it.
Right. But this book shows us it is a full-body event, a full-body disruption.
And that means it requires a full-body solution.
So let's start by just trying to grasp the sheer scope of this issue. We often think of trauma as this isolated thing, an event that affects one person.
But the book immediately challenges that narrow view.
Okay, so let's talk about the pervasive reach of these traumatic traces.
Well, the traces, as van der Kolk details them, they reach so far beyond the individual who was, directly exposed to the violence or the catastrophe.
Because we're social creatures.
We're intensely social, deeply wired creatures. So when one person in a system gets traumatized, the entire system absorbs that shock. You have to consider the ripple effect.
You mean like a silent legacy passed down within families, often without anyone even realizing it's happening?
That's exactly it. The book gives these heartbreaking examples. You have soldiers coming back from combat, right? They struggle with these unpredictable rages or emotional detachment or just paralyzing fear. And that, in turn, frightens their partners and their children.
And the partners themselves, the wives of men with PTSD, for example, often become depressed.
They do. They're essentially suffering from a kind of secondary trauma.
And if the main caregiver is emotionally absent or, chronically depressed because of the trauma, what happens to the children?
Well, the children suffer a catastrophic developmental failure. It's really tragic. The children of depressed, detached, or just emotionally absent parents are at a super high risk of growing up insecure, anxious.
And they lack a reliable way to self-soothe.
Right. It's this dark, unspoken secret, a psychological inheritance that's passed down not through words, but through nervous system dysregulation.
Which brings us to this core, really painful paradox of trauma. It is inherently unbearable. So what's the price that victims pay trying to manage that unbearable internal reality?
They pay a tremendous price in pure energy. The book makes it really clear that victims, whether they're survivors of war or abuse or neglect, spend this colossal amount of psychological energy just pushing the memory down.
Pushing the sensations and feelings out of conscious awareness.
They're trying so desperately to act as if nothing happened and just move on.
And that's often fueled by a massive amount of shame.
Huge shame. Shame over their perceived weakness or vulnerability during the event, or shame over the fact that they couldn't stop it.
And this constant suppression. It must be exhausting.
It's an exhausting, lifelong battle that just severely limits their capacity to be present and engaged in their own lives.
That energy expenditure has to be what keeps them trapped. They're fighting the past so hard they have no energy left for the present.
Or the future. And society, as the book argues, often colludes in this suppression.
How so?
Society provides very little comfort, actually. We compound the problem because we have such a profound difficulty bearing witness to pain and cruelty.
Especially when it's close to home.
Exactly. It is so much easier to maintain this comforting illusion that, true evil happens far away in places like Darfur or the Congo. But the data just shows otherwise.
The facts are staggering, aren't they?
They really are. And they should challenge every assumption you have about safety. Domestic violence affects nearly a third of couples in the United States.
A third. Wow.
Yeah. And the book grimly notes that for every one soldier in a war zone abroad, there are at least 10 children who are endangered in their own homes.
That is just, it's too painful for most people to acknowledge.
It is. So we turn a blind eye. And in doing so, we just reinforce the victim's isolation.
Okay, so this pervasive avoidance meant that for decades, the symptoms of trauma just didn't fit into these neat little diagnostic boxes of psychiatry.
Not at all.
Let's talk about that critical early observation that changed everything, the one from Abram Gardner.
Gardner's work was absolutely pivotal. This was in the early 20th century, mostly with World War I veterans, and he was defining what he called traumatic neuroses.
Which was the precursor to what we now call PTSD.
Right. He was one of the first to look beyond things like hysteria or shell shock and notice this consistent pattern of physical and emotional collapse. And his critical finding, which the book really emphasizes, was in this one groundbreaking phrase.
Which was?
The nucleus of the neurosis is a physioneurosis.
A physioneurosis? That's a radical reframing, isn't it?
It's huge.
It's suggesting the symptoms aren't just, mental weakness or a lack of moral fiber.
But that they are rooted in the entire body's physical response to the overwhelming event.
It established a physiological basis for something that had been dismissed for so long as just a psychological collapse.
Or a moral failure. The system, the body, the nervous system, it had been structurally damaged by the event and it was just stuck in that defensive mode.
The veteran, Tom, whose story is so central here, he perfectly illustrates that stuckness.
Tom's narrative is just heartbreaking. His life, for all intents and purposes, it stopped in 1969, the moment he survived a catastrophic ambush.
And the trauma transformed him.
Completely. Before, he was this devoted, loyal, present husband and friend. Afterward, he was just consumed by the event. It led to this profound emotional numbness. He described it as living behind a glass wall.
Physically present, but emotionally impenetrable.
And the tragic irony is that he only felt fully alive when he was reliving the terror.
So the past became more real than the present.
Precisely. The traumatic past became his sole source of meaning. This just shows how the brain, trying to process the shock, gets locked into that memory and hijacks the present.
And for men like Tom, early clinicians just mislabeled them.
Oh, completely. They were just tossed into these buckets of generalized diagnoses. Alcoholism, depression, character disorder.
Even schizophrenia.
Right. And these labels were often derogatory. They totally failed to capture the core physiological crisis that was actually happening.
And the standard treatment back then, forcing them to talk through all the details, that was actually harmful.
It was often catastrophic. Trying to make them narrate the exact details of the trauma in a sterile clinical setting, it would frequently trigger full-blown flashbacks.
So it just compounded the trauma?
It did. It forced them to relive the terror in real time. Sometimes that led to violent outbursts or total dissociation. It made the treatment ineffective or, even worse.
What about medication at the time?
The early tranquilizers, they just left them in this emotionally flat fog, barely able to function. It just removed any possibility of them gaining true emotional mastery.
Okay, so the shame component here is so central to this cycle of being stuck.
Yeah.
And the book carefully dissects its dual nature.
There's the shame of commission, which is often felt by soldiers who participated in or just witnessed atrocity.
Right, and then there's the other side.
A profound shame of omission, the feeling of perceived helplessness. This is really common in survivors of child abuse or rape, where the victim feels shame for not fighting back effectively.
Or for trying to placate or appease the abuser.
Which is a desperate survival strategy that gets misinterpreted as compliance. This huge burden of shame is what often dictates the next psychological move, which is numbing.
Emotional numbing. The ultimate defensive retreat, often described as detachment.
It's a profound disconnection. Tom felt emotionally distant from everybody. He couldn't evoke deep feelings for his family, so he retreated behind that glass wall.
And this disconnection, it extends to the self, right?
Profoundly. Individuals report hardly recognizing themselves in the mirror, feeling alienated from their own reflection.
They observe their own actions as if they're floating in space.
Yeah, a deep depersonalization,
Yeah.
a sense of watching a movie that stars themselves. It's the ultimate defense mechanism. If I am not fully here, I can't be fully hurt.
The chilling effect of this on the capacity for human imagination is revealed in those Rorschach test results.
Oh, that experiment provided such a shocking clinical snapshot of the fragmented inner world.
It was a stark measure of how trauma constricts the mind.
It was. I mean, the
Yeah.
Rorschach test, it presents you with these ambiguous ink blots, and it demands that you use mental flexibility and imagination to interpret them. The results were just dramatic. They showed two extremes of a shattered imagination.
What were those extremes?
Okay, so the first group, and this was 16 out of 21 veterans, they just superimposed graphic traumatic images directly onto the ink blot.
So they weren't imagining anything.
No, they saw the bowels of my friend, or a decapitated head, a car wreck. They were just replaying an old, terrifying reel. Their past had colonized their present perception.
And the second group, the ones who went blank. That seems like an even deeper psychological tragedy.
I think so, yes. The remaining 5 simply saw nothing, just a bunch of ink.
Wow.
The normal human response is to use our imagination to find patterns in stories and meaning and ambiguity. But these men had lost that capacity for mental play.
That flexibility of mind.
They were so overwhelmed by the inner landscape of terror that they had shut down the entire capacity to project meaning outward. Trauma, just. It profoundly affects the imagination. It leaves survivors trapped between reliving the terror and experiencing this absolute terrifying blankness.
That brings us directly into the realm of modern science. The observation that trauma is physiological has now been completely validated by technology that lets us look inside the head.
Absolutely. The understanding of trauma has been revolutionized in the last few decades.
By mapping the damage in real time.
Right. Our current understanding is driven by the confluence of 3 critical new fields: neuroscience, developmental psychopathology,
Which examines how adverse experiences impact a child's development.
and interpersonal neurobiology, which looks at how our behavior literally influences the biology and brain structure of those around us.
And the fundamental organizational principle of the brain, the operating system that trauma breaks, is survival.
That's it. Survival is the #1 priority. The brain is organized in this highly efficient bottom-up architecture.
And it has 5 core non-negotiable imperatives.
Correct. First, generating body signals: hunger, rest, safety needs. Second, creating a coherent internal map of the world.
Okay.
Third, generating energy and action, the drive to move. Fourth, warning us of danger and opportunity. And fifth, adjusting our actions moment by moment.
So psychological problems aren't just philosophical issues.
No, they emerge when these basic survival functions break down and fail to integrate.
The book simplifies the brain's evolutionary development into 3 key hierarchical layers, which is a great way for you, the listener, to visualize the structure.
It is. We start at the foundation,
Yeah.
the primitive reptilian brain. This is the brainstem and hypothalamus, and it's the seat of basic survival.
So breathing, heart rate, temperature.
Homeostasis,
Right.
all the vital functions. This is the oldest, most foundational part. Above that, you have the limbic or mammalian brain.
The emotional center.
Right. It houses the amygdala or danger monitor and crucial areas for social connection and memory.
And the limbic brain is the area that's most dramatically shaped by our earliest experiences, isn't it?
Exactly. It operates on that principle that neurons that fire together wire together.
So if a child's environment is safe and predictable,
Then this brain specializes in curiosity, exploration, and cooperation. But if the child is consistently frightened or abandoned or abused, this region specializes in fear, hypervigilance, and anticipating deprivation.
it becomes a factory for defense.
And finally, you have the pinnacle of human development, the part that allows us to reflect and plan.
The frontal lobes.
The frontal lobes are responsible for our unique human capacities.
Yeah.
Language, abstract thought, reflection, planning, choice.
And critically, social harmony.
Yes, the ability to understand that other people have different thoughts and feelings than we do. But the book emphasizes that a key mechanism of trauma is that it short-circuits this entire hierarchy.
How so?
Under threat, the system reverts to the bottom layers. The frontal lobes, the seat of rational reflection, go completely offline.
Turning the person into a creature of habit and reaction.
Exactly. lacking the flexibility, creativity, and self-control that are necessary for mature adult function.
Let's focus on that short circuit. The analogy of the amygdala as the brain's smoke detector is incredibly useful for understanding the immediate trauma response.
It's a perfect metaphor because the amygdala is designed to prioritize speed over accuracy. It detects a potential threat, a sudden noise, a specific smell, an angry tone of voice, and it instantly triggers the release of powerful stress hormones.
Cortisol and adrenaline.
And this prepares the body for immediate life-saving action, fight or flight. Heart rate and blood pressure increase, blood goes to the large muscles, pain sensitivity drops.
Which is magnificent when a bear is chasing you.
Absolutely.
But in PTSD, the bear has been gone for 10 years, and the smoke detector won't stop ringing.
That's precisely it. The core pathology of PTSD is that the stress hormone system fails to return to equilibrium long after the danger has passed.
So this continued excessive secretion of stress hormones manifests as what?
Constant agitation, panic, and hypervigilance. This relentless cascade of cortisol and adrenaline, it wreaks havoc on the body's long-term health.
Leading to chronic inflammation, autoimmune issues.
And increased vulnerability to all kinds of physical illness. Furthermore, the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain's watchtower that's supposed to quiet the amygdala, its regulatory capacity is significantly reduced.
So the person startles easily, rages easily.
Or freezes unexpectedly when touched, because the brain cannot distinguish between past danger and present safety.
This inability to regain control connects back to one of the most foundational and, I think, difficult psychological concepts in the book, learned helplessness.
Ah, yes. The classic research by Mayer and Seligman on inescapable shock with dogs.
Right.
It demonstrated that trauma instills this fundamental visceral orientation of helplessness. If the dogs learned that no matter what they did, the shock just kept coming.
They eventually stopped trying to escape.
Even when the escape route was reopened, they simply endured the pain, having learned that nothing they did mattered.
And the insight for human treatment, according to the book, is that you can't just tell a person that they're safe now.
Exactly. The key insight for treatment was visceral. The only way to reverse learned helplessness in the animals was through repeated physical experience of escape.
They had to literally drag the dogs out.
Literally. They had to drag them out of the shock cages so they could feel the escape, allowing the body to register a sensation of efficacy and control.
And the parallel for human trauma survivors is clear.
They don't just need to talk about their feelings. They need concrete, visceral experiences through movement, touch, and physical action to restore that fundamental sense of agency and control over their own bodies.
So any therapy that relies just on cognitive stuff like medication without addressing the body's encoding of terror?
It's often doomed to failure.
So when the system is overwhelmed and you can't fight or flee, the final defense mechanism kicks in. Dissociation. The book calls this the very essence of trauma.
It's where the self shatters. Dissociation is where the overwhelming experience is split off or compartmentalized because it's just too much to integrate into a coherent self-narrative.
So the different components of the event, the emotions, the sounds, the images, they take on a life of their own.
They constantly intrude into the present as if they are literally being relived. The trauma is no longer a historical memory, it becomes a state of being.
An internal battlefield played out on your own body.
That's a good way to put it.
This mechanism is mapped perfectly through those critical brain scans. Specifically, the contrast between Stan, who is reliving the event, and Ute, who is blanking out.
Yes.
What did Stan's scan show as he was having a flashback of his car crash?
Stan's scan revealed this frightening physiological truth about flashbacks. As the memory was activated, his amygdala showed intense activation. His heart raced, he started sweating. He truly believed he was going to die.
But here's the critical finding.
The critical finding was that his left brain, the area responsible for language, logical sequencing, and providing a sense of time, the now versus the then, it went virtually offline.
So he was trapped in this immediate, terrifying sensory experience without the cognitive resources to label it or recognize it as past.
Precisely. He couldn't form a coherent narrative. He was experiencing it in a timeless present. This explains why standard talk therapy fails during a flashback.
The language center just isn't functioning.
It isn't. The right brain, which holds raw images and emotions, is running the show, while the left brain, the rational interpreter, is silenced.
And Uete, his wife, she presented the clinical opposite, the blanking out response.
Ute's response was depersonalization, which is the biological freeze reaction taken to an extreme. Instead of hyperactivation, her scan showed decreased activation across nearly the entire brain.
A global shutdown.
Right. It reflected the biological freeze response, a state where everything is muted, where focus and thinking are dramatically interfered with. She had dissociated her fear and felt nothing.
This loss of self-awareness ties directly back to the limitation of language.
It does.
If the brain shuts down the verbal centers during distress, expecting survivors to neatly articulate their suffering seems impossible.
It's like asking someone with a broken leg to run a marathon. That's a perfect analogy. Trauma drives us to the edge of comprehension.
The brain regions needed to translate intense sensation into words just shut down.
And so survivors are left with these fragmented imprints, raw images, isolated sounds, and unnameable physical sensations. They often develop a cover story for public consumption.
A socially acceptable narrative.
But the book stresses that these cover stories rarely capture the inner visceral truth because it is enormously difficult to organize one's traumatic experiences into a coherent account.
So the full story can only be told after the underlying body and brain structures are repaired.
Exactly, after self-regulation is restored.
Okay, let's move from singular catastrophic events to the pervasive crisis of chronic relational trauma, especially in childhood. This is where the problem really shifts from individual tragedy to a societal epidemic.
Early relational trauma, so abuse, neglect, or chronic emotional violence from caregivers, is generally the most difficult trauma to treat.
Why is that?
The reason is structural. The source of the terror isn't an external one-time enemy. It's the very people who are meant to provide safety, protection, and love.
So the child's most essential protective buffer is removed.
It is. And to survive this paradox, the child is often forced to shut down emotionally and ignore their own internal feelings. They essentially sacrifice their internal world for external survival.
This is where John Bowlby's attachment theory becomes the essential framework for understanding the damage.
Absolutely. Bowlby established that our earliest experiences with our primary caregivers create the foundational template, the prototype, for all of our later connections and relationships.
So if a child has good enough caregiving,
they learn a profound visceral lesson that broken connections can be repaired, and they can incorporate a deep sense of internal safety. This safe attachment is fundamental to mental health.
it teaches the nervous system how to calm down after stress.
Exactly.
But what happens when that caregiving is consistently inconsistent or threatening or just absent?
That leads to what we call disorganized attachment. It's the most unstable form. The child receives care that is either intrusive and hostile or helpless and fearful.
Which prevents the child from developing a reliable internal way to calm themselves down.
Right. The child is terrified of the parent, yet completely dependent on them. This instability forces the child to constantly anticipate rejection and deprivation. The body learns to stay in a state of high alert.
And that increases the likelihood of chronic dissociation.
It's a simultaneous, desperate attempt to know the danger in order to survive it, while not knowing it in order to stay bonded.
A profound failure of the body's self-regulation system.
And it's rooted entirely in those early relationship dynamics. If a baby cries and the parent responds with anger or detachment, the baby learns that expressing distress is dangerous.
So they have to block out the external hostility and the internal feeling of distress.
Leaving the nervous system stuck in this highly volatile defensive posture that will define their adult emotional reactions.
So if attachment theory explains the depth of the relational damage, the adverse childhood experiences, or ACE study, reveals the terrifying scale of the fallout across society.
Yes, the study by Vincent Felitti and Robert Ananda. The findings were just devastating.
Partly because of the population they studied, right?
That was what was so shocking. It shattered the prevailing myth that high levels of trauma only affected marginalized or low-income populations.
This study was done with over 17,000 largely white, middle-class, well-educated, and financially secure patients.
At Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. And the findings showed that adverse childhood experiences, things like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, were vastly more common and interrelated than anyone expected.
The statistics are humbling.
Only 1/3 of the respondents reported 0 ACEs.
And the most frightening part is the dose-response curve, showing that the impact is cumulative.
And catastrophic. The higher the ACE scores, so the more types of adverse experiences, the worse the adult health and social outcomes become. The correlation is staggering.
I remember reading for women with an ACE score of 4 or more, the prevalence of severe adult depression jumps to 66%.
compared to only 12% for those with a score of 0.
And the connection to high-risk behaviors and addiction is maybe the most direct evidence that the solution isn't moral judgment, but trauma treatment.
Without a doubt. The likelihood of alcoholism is 7 times higher for those with high ACE scores. And the statistics on IV drug use are horrifying.
What are they?
The likelihood for those with an ACE score of 6 or more is 4,600% higher than for those with a 0 score.
4,600%. That's a public health emergency.
It is. When the nervous system is perpetually agitated, people self-medicate. They reach for the most powerful substances to extinguish that inner, unbearable fire.
And the ripple effect doesn't stop at self-harm. It profoundly impacts future relationship patterns, perpetuating the cycle of violence.
It does. The book highlights that girls who witness domestic violence are at a much higher risk of ending up in violent relationships themselves.
And boys who witness it.
They increase their risk of abusing their own partners 7-fold. And on top of that, the chronic physiological stress leads to a much higher incidence of physical illnesses.
Autoimmune disorders, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia.
High rates of asthma, because the body's inflammatory systems are constantly overactivated by stress hormones.
This overwhelming data led Felitti and the author to a really counterintuitive conclusion that often problems are really solutions.
This represents a radical shift in treatment philosophy. It means we cannot mistake the symptom for the disease.
So behaviors often labeled as self-destructive addiction, self-harm, severe obesity, they frequently began as desperate, necessary solutions to cope with the trauma.
And often highly successful solutions.
The story of the patient whose severe obesity launched the ACE study is a perfect illustration of this.
She is. She rapidly regained 300 pounds after a successful loss. And the reason was chilling.
Her newly thin body attracted male attention,
which immediately triggered the visceral terror of her childhood incest history. Her massive weight gain wasn't a sign of moral weakness.
It was an extreme, successful psychological shield against sexual threat.
Exactly. As another rape victim put it, overweight is overlooked, and that's the way I need to be. The weight provided a feeling of invisibility and safety.
So if you treat the obesity or the addiction without addressing the underlying trauma, you're basically tearing down a necessary psychological fort.
That's precisely right. Mistaking the solution for the actual problem often leads to treatment failure, or worse, the emergence of other, sometimes catastrophic problems like suicidality, once that coping mechanism is forcibly removed.
So the therapeutic mandate is clear. You have to treat the root trauma, not just the protective behavior.
The physiological terror itself, yes.
Given all this complexity, especially the non-narrative chronic nature of childhood trauma, it's not surprising that the standard diagnostic system, the DSM, is failing these victims.
The book really stresses this major diagnostic blind spot. Traditional PTSD criteria were designed for acute, single-event traumas, war, natural disasters, and they specifically require the memory of a particular event.
But victims of chronic, complex trauma often don't have that neat narrative structure.
Their trauma is a series of relational microaggressions and constant states of fear. The failure is stark. 82% of traumatized children seen in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network do not meet the current PTSD criteria.
So instead, these children get a bewildering array of meaningless labels that just confuse the issue.
Oppositional defiant disorder, borderline personality disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. It leads to years of misdirected treatment.
And researchers, including van der Kolk, have worked to define a more consistent, observable pattern they call developmental trauma disorder, or DTD.
Right. And the proposed criteria for DTD capture the pervasive profile seen in these children.
Which is what?
Pervasive dysregulation, so rapid, unpredictable mood shifts, intense tantrums, or sudden panic. Then there are chronic problems with attention and concentration.
Because all their internal energy is focused on survival monitoring.
Exactly. And a host of mysterious physical problems.
What sort of physical problems are we talking about?
Chronic sleep problems, unexplained, pervasive pain, and hypersensitivity to touch or sound. Their nervous systems are just constantly operating at a high frequency.
And these DTD children often engage in self-harming activities.
Cutting, burning. Not because they're trying to die, but as a desperate, embodied attempt to relieve unbearable internal tension or to gain a fleeting sense of control over their bodies.
And central to this disconnect between mind and body is the concept of alexithymia, the inability to put feelings into words, which must severely hinder therapy.
It does. Alexithymia literally translates from Greek as not having words for feelings. Many traumatized individuals simply cannot identify or articulate what their internal physical sensations mean.
They might appear furious, but genuinely deny feeling angry.
Or look rigid with terror, but insist they are fine. This inability to discern what is happening inside their own bodies causes profound problems with self-care.
They ignore internal signals of hunger, fatigue, or illness until they reach a crisis point.
And brain scans actually confirm this. The more alexithymic a person is, the less activity is registered in the self-sensing areas of the brain. They are literally out of touch with their body's internal somatic reality.
So if trauma is defined by this physiological fragmentation and the loss of self-awareness, then the solution has to involve a revolution in treatment that addresses the body directly, not just the mind.
We're moving beyond the exclusive domain of talk therapy.
Let's start with one of the most effective somatic therapies detailed in the book, EMDR.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. It works based on the understanding that these fragmented traumatic memories remain stuck in the emotional brain, just frozen in time.
And the mechanism uses bilateral stimulation.
Right, often side-to-side eye movements, but sometimes tapping or audio stimulation. And it's thought to activate the brain's natural memory processing system.
Similar to what happens organically during REM sleep.
Exactly.
So the goal then is to take that raw, terrifying sensory imprint and help the brain convert it into an integrated, coherent story of the past.
Precisely. It turns a present, horrifying experience like Stan's flashback into a neutral historical narrative. And the effectiveness studies are highly compelling.
The book details a major study comparing EMDR, the SSRI drug Prozac, and a placebo.
And the results showed EMDR was substantially more effective than medication or placebo.
And crucially, the long-term results favored EMDR dramatically, which suggests a fundamental neurological repair happened.
After 8 sessions, 1 in 4 patients were classified as completely cured. Their PTSD scores dropped to negligible levels. Compare that with only 1 in 10 of the Prozac group.
Wow. And 8 months later?
8 months later, 60% of the EMDR patients remained cured and continued to improve spontaneously. They had integrated the trauma.
Yep.
Whereas the Prozac group often relapsed once they went off the drug.
Kolk describes it beautifully. He says EMDR kicks the log and the river of memory processing starts flowing again.
It's a great image.
The case of Kathy perfectly illustrates how this requires such minimal verbal input from the therapist. It relies instead on the brain's own self-healing capacity.
Kathy's process activated this torrent of unsought images, sensations, and emotions all through the bilateral stimulation. The therapist was just a guide, providing safety. The core work was all internal.
And her EMDR sequences culminated not just in remembering the abuse,
but in an imaginative, victorious resolution.
What was that culmination? What did she see that demonstrated the integration?
She pictured her big me holding my little me, a really powerful image of self-reparenting and protection.
Mm-hmm.
And then she imagined physically pushing her abusive father out of the coffee house where the abuse had occurred, while onlookers mocked him.
So this imaginative shift from a powerless, terrified child to an active, self-led intervener, that was the key.
That was the key to integration. The trauma was no longer a state of paralysis. It was a processed, finite story where she finally achieved agency.
Moving to another revolutionary approach, internal family systems, or IFS, which fundamentally changes how we conceptualize the mind.
Right. Instead of a single damaged self, it sees the psyche as a society of different active parts.
And IFS asserts that every person has a core, undamaged self.
A source of qualities like calm, curiosity, compassion, and confidence. But trauma forces other aspects of the personality to take on these extreme, burdensome protective roles.
And these protectors are divided into managers and firefighters,
whose sole job is to shield the exiles.
So who are the exiles?
The exiles are the young child parts, frozen in the traumatic time, carrying the raw terror, pain, and shame of the original event. They're banished to the subconscious to keep the person functional.
And the managers are preventative.
They're the critical, perfectionistic, controlling, and often shaming parts that try to keep the exiles contained and keep people away from triggering situations.
And the firefighters.
The firefighters are reactive. If the exiles break out and those painful feelings surface, the firefighters rush in impulsively to extinguish the pain.
These are the parts that lead to addiction, cutting, eating disorders.
Compulsive sexual activity. They're desperate rescuers, but their methods are ultimately destructive.
So the goal of IFS is achieving self-leadership and unblending.
Exactly. The shift has to occur from being blended with, apart from saying, I am angry, to recognizing the part's function. Part of me is furious because it feels unseen.
That creates curiosity and distance.
It does.
Yeah.
And the therapeutic task is to ask the protective managers and firefighters to stand back temporarily, guaranteeing them that the core self will approach and care for the exiled child parts, alleviating their burden.
The story of Peter, the harsh doctor who is terrified of vulnerability, illustrates how managers operate.
Peter's ruthless judging of others and his constant critical self-talk was a powerful manager part. It was desperately trying to protect him from feeling the profound hurt and helplessness he experienced as a boy being beaten by his father.
So when he finally accessed the exiled part, the terrified, weak little boy, his immediate reaction was deep disgust.
Which was actually another manager, the internal critic, preventing him from feeling compassion.
How was the healing achieved there?
The therapist coaxed the critic to step back. And only when Peter, guided by his core self, could approach the exiled boy with curiosity and compassion, could true healing begin.
And in an imaginative exercise.
Peter finally took self-led action. He confronted his father as a grown man and took the exiled boy part to a safe, beautiful place. This internal, imaginative intervention fundamentally shifted his internal ecology,
leading to the relaxation of his inner critics.
And a noticeable repair of his external relationships, both professional and romantic.
So IFS and EMDR are powerful, but trauma is fundamentally encoded in the visceral nervous system. How do we directly approach regulating that physical internal state?
That is the domain of neurofeedback, or NF, a fundamental bottom-up intervention. NF uses EEG patterns electroencephalography to help patients self-regulate their arousal state.
And this is crucial because traumatized people show unusually low heart rate variability, or HRV. Let's pause on HRV because it's a key physiological measure. What does low HRV actually signify?
Okay, so HRV is the variation in the time interval between heartbeats. And it reflects the balance between our sympathetic nervous system, the accelerator for fight-flight, and our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the brake for rest and digest.
So low HRV means these systems are out of sync?
The brake isn't working effectively, and the accelerator is constantly engaged. This makes the person profoundly vulnerable to illness and chronic stress, prone to over-responding to minor stressors.
And NF trains the brain to produce more coherent brain waves.
Right. It rewards patterns associated with calm, like alpha or theta waves, and directly improves this autonomic nervous system regulation.
The recovery of Lisa, who suffered severe developmental trauma and pervasive dissociation, is a stunning testament to NF's ability to restore this coherence.
Lisa's life was just dominated by this omnipresent terror and deep emotional fragmentation. She described hearing a constant hum of low-level conversations in her head. She feared she was schizophrenic.
And she coped by obsessively memorizing everything about people.
Out of fear of getting things wrong, she couldn't form authentic, meaningful attachments. But after starting NF, which focused on rewarding more stable brain patterns in her fear center, she stopped dissociating.
And the intrusive noises quieted.
Yes, and that stabilization was the real breakthrough.
It was.
Her stunning revelation was that she could finally engage in therapy authentically, not based on fear or memorization, because she was no longer in constant fight or flight mode. Her brain was regulated enough for her to be present.
Which highlights that crucial point. Bottom-up regulation must often precede top-down cognitive work.
You have to calm the physiology before you can reason with the mind.
And this bottom-up approach includes simple, accessible practices that use the body to calm the nervous system.
Absolutely. The body's always available to us. Practices like focused breathing are fundamental. By paying close attention to the out-breath, making it longer than the inhale, you actively use the parasympathetic brake.
Engaging the vagus nerve.
Which directly reduces the hyperactivity of the amygdala and brings the nervous system toward equilibrium. Movement, yoga, martial arts, they all serve the same function.
Using the body to teach the brain that it is safe now.
Exactly.
Finally, we have to acknowledge that healing trauma, which is inherently isolating, requires connection and physical engagement within a community context.
Social support is arguably the most powerful protection against being overwhelmed by stress. But for those whose trauma occurred within relationships, trust is destroyed.
So we need therapeutic approaches that bypass the need for verbal trust.
And leverage community and embodiment to repair this primal sense of connection and attunement.
The psychomotor therapy structures detailed in the book are a fascinating example of this.
PBSP, or psychomotor body-based structures, it allows participants to externalize their inner reality in a three-dimensional space, using others as placeholders for family members.
This is not just role-playing.
No, it is creating a new, supplementary, visceral memory. Take the example of Maria. She was able to create a new, powerful experience of protection by having a placeholder for an ideal mother, who she chose to be a strong martial artist figure.
Stand up to her terrifying father figure.
Right, saying, we are not going to sit here and listen to this shit.
That must bypass the cognitive logic that says it's impossible to change the past.
It does. It doesn't erase the bad memory, but it offers a fresh, viscerally experienced alternative of protection and attuned care that the nervous system can finally register. The body feels safe for the first time in that situation.
And the power of communal rhythms. You think about Archbishop Desmond Tutu during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa.
Tutu recognized the physiological reality of collective trauma. When witnesses would become overwhelmed and physically collapse while recounting atrocities, he would interrupt the testimony.
And he would lead the entire audience in collective prayer, song, and dance.
Which allowed participants to physically pendulate out of the horror, moving away from the traumatic activation and grounding them in the collective, stabilizing rhythm before gently returning to the narrative.
This concept of muscular bonding.
Seen also in military close-order drill, it creates solidarity and helps people contain and process otherwise overwhelming emotion.
And theater provides a unique and powerful way for traumatized individuals to overcome numbing and fragmentation.
By forcing them back into physical, emotional embodiment.
Trauma makes people shut down, fragmented, and dissociated. Theater demands the opposite.
Embodying complex emotions, intense physical engagement, and finding one's authentic voice. Techniques like mirroring, where adolescents learn to move in tandem, help them overcome paralyzing self-consciousness and attune viscerally to others.
A primal skill often lost in complex trauma. The story of Edward, the adolescent in the theater workshop, is a profound example of this embodied release.
Edward had a history of violence and shut-down behavior. He realized that a wave of sadness came over him every time he performed a specific role across the floor.
The director, seeing this, forced him to connect that sensation to a dramatic monologue.
Eventually leading him to embody the memory of his mother giving birth to him prematurely. When he finally allowed himself to scream and push the energy out, the witnesses described megatons of energy and tension leaving his body.
So theater provides a safe, contained space for these kids to grapple with the substance of tragedy.
Betrayal, assault, destruction, and, through physical movement and voice, experience competence and secure connection. The antithesis of the isolation and helplessness trauma instills.
This deep dive into the body keeps the score has been monumental. It reveals trauma as a systems failure, not a moral one.
Right.
If there is one core takeaway we want you, our listener, to internalize, it's that healing trauma is about reestablishing self-leadership.
The integrated ownership of your body, your mind, and your life.
And this is achieved by intentionally combining that top-down cognitive work like IFS and narrative therapy with the bottom-up body-based practices.
EMDR, yoga, movement, and neurofeedback.
For you, the learner, the challenge is straightforward yet profound. Begin with interoception.
That is the awareness of your internal physical sensations. Just become curious about your internal state. Don't judge it. Simply observe it.
Where do you feel tension? What does anxiety truly feel like in your chest or your stomach?
And how does that shift when you breathe out slowly? Befriending those internal sensations, treating them as information rather than enemies, is the first crucial step towards self-change.
It allows you to regulate your physical state before it hijacks your rational mind.
It's incredibly empowering to realize that the body, which was the repository of the trauma, can also become the ultimate pathway to long-term healing.
It is. But we have to end with the final provocative thought, reflecting on the scale of the societal failure that Kolk addresses.
The book forces us to see trauma as a massive, ongoing public health catastrophe that our society continues to ignore or underfund, prioritizing punitive measures over prevention.
The statistics are horrifying.
Since 2001, far more Americans have died at the hands of family or partners than in all wars abroad combined. The prevalence of violence and neglect, as the ACE study showed, is staggering across every socioeconomic class.
So if we truly internalize the truth that the body keeps the score, the investment priorities of our entire nation would have to shift entirely.
They would fundamentally shift. If we prioritize funding and support for early childhood programs and invested in creating genuinely trauma-sensitive environments.
If we stopped cutting essential elements like recess, physical education, music, and chorus.
Which all involve crucial communal and rhythmic regulation. If we did that, we could fundamentally transform the health and well-being of society.
We could move away from a world driven by fear, reactive violence, and addictive coping mechanisms.
Toward one defined by secure attachment, curiosity, competence, play, and secure human connection. The future of public health, and really the future of our society, rests entirely on recognizing the physical reality of the past.